We're going to address our concentration to matters of rhythm and pulse. And in order to, first of all, at the outset, differentiate the concept of rhythm versus pulse, they are not indeed the same thing. I looked up pulse, and a very nice, one of the definitions I found was the palpable beat resulting from such pulse as detected in a superficial artery. Also, the number of individual beats in a specified time period, such as 1 minute. A transient variation of a quantity, such as an electric current or voltage, or a sound wave, whose value is normally constant. But I like this most intriguing definition of pulse. The underlying sentiment or opinion or an indication of it, like having our finger on the pulse of the time. When we talk about pulse in musical terms, we are resorting to metronomic time, a constant pulse. I mean, not to say that our own blood flow doesn't wane and ebb in terms of our excitement or our rest, but pulse is meant to be something regular. I mean, when they talk about electric current, there's nothing more regular than electric current or sound wave. This definition of rhythm is a nice one that I found. Rhythm is the systematic arrangement of musical sounds, principally according to duration and periodic stress. I like that. As I see it, rhythm is the inherent motion and pace innate to a musical pattern. As pianists playing on our own, the progress of time and tempo is not unshakably metronomic, as I will remind some of you about my practice at From the Top with my young soloists. And whenever they had a cadenza, I encouraged them not to continue with their furioso tempo, but to see that as a place where the composer says, you now are in sole control of the passage of time and the sculpting of space. And so when I think of us playing solo music, I think of the same kind of freedom. We are ourselves the creators of the fabric and the fabrication of tempo and time. We must tailor the texture of time, always setting our own pace, not letting the tempo play us. I have so often been guilty of catching the tempo train rather than driving it. This ceases to be a result of being strictly disciplined and develops into a truly interactive acknowledgement of the occasional conflicting momentums, for instance, within a fugue subject. We become controllers rather than the uncontrolled. With our two hands, we need to master and cultivate the depth of independence and characterizations by all available means, making it a primary resource and font of inspiration and imagination. In our work with the Well Tempered Clavier, Bach's most important lesson to us is training us how to harvest the clearest projection of counterpoint. We are always striving towards clarity. As we have seen, there are many levels on which we can cultivate clarity, many variable values within the parameters of notation, many tools we are actually becoming familiar with. We have enlisted flexibilities of articulation and dynamics. The contrast of character and impetus is best described and manipulated within this realm of rhythm. Here, we are focused on how clearly we can project an innate sense within a musical texture of the clarity and truth we illuminate through engaging with rhythm in microcosm and in context. The rhythmic fabric we need to be conscious of is not beats per minute, but the pulse, the exchange in its present state. When we are in a predominantly 16th motoric texture, we have the opportunity to affect the fabric not only on the basis of the current rate of exchange, the 16th note, but on a molecular, subatomic, subdivided beat basis in 32nd notes. This method yields great dividends in explorational practice and public performance. We'll address the practical applications later in today's session. So to reiterate, rhythm, I feel, is the inherent motion and pace innate to a musical pattern. A musical pattern can be a measure or two, or a brief motive, or perhaps just the yin and yang of a two-note molecule. It's an important distinction to make, rhythm versus pulse, the unfolding in its own proper time of the properties inherent in a musical gesture versus presumptuous fealty to tempo overall. To place this ambiguity of pace in context, I contend that even within one fugue subject, syllables, the little bits, the motives that make up the fugue subject, syllables is how the harpsichordist Ralph Kirkpatrick referred to those elements that make up the fugue, recognizable as distinct and separate. To place this ambiguity of pace in context, I contend that even within one fugue subject, syllables may be competing, conflicting, contrasting from a presumed tempo. There is oftentimes a discernible difference in character at the cellular, elemental level of components of the subject. Some fugue subjects may indeed host a dual nature, a palpable yin and yang sense of contrasting energies. We must accept and acknowledge the inner rhythmic truth of the smaller rhythmic groups, the syllables. More contemplative, placid syllables within the subject mitigate for a more serene, unruffled, even tempo-less pulse. I have my favorites among this floating, alienated, tempo-free world I'll share with you quite shortly. Other syllables within the subject present quite openly opposites, doppelgangers, suggesting in their motive nature a more forward-leaning, momentous rhythmic motion. The yin and yang of the inevitable and the immovable. We take a subject apart in this molecular syllabic way so that we can seek to discern each syllable's true nature. We need to discover each syllable's unique character, and only when we feel we've come to know each one instinctively, personally, that we feel we know the syllable's truest energy and pace. Only then can we string the syllables together and decide what conflicts or contrasts between them mitigate for a faster or slower overall tempo, or whether we want to somehow accommodate a richer, less strict tempo range. More importantly, we should become comfortable with the contradictions of momentum within the subject and decide that tempo and pulse are not as important than inhabiting each syllable integrally and projecting each one in its own pace and its character as though inevitably. One of the nice things about playing solo is we don't have to worry about the conductor messing things up for us. And I just wanted to point out the futility of actually conducting this in a normal way, in other words, in a regular pulse, and that I'm much more apt to be inspired by Czerny's recollection of Beethoven as playing this opening downbeat A fortissimo. But even at that point, I start. So if I wanted to conduct that, how would I do it? I mean, because it wouldn't be dum, ba, 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 it just doesn't say anything. It would probably be something like rum, and then that space, that rest, would be of an indeterminate nature. It would probably depend on the hall, whether it rang like a Bravanel or whether it was in a schoolroom. You would have to just decide based on the sound when you go on, and you wouldn't be able to decide that going yum. That's not truly reacting and interacting with the material, because one of the other ways to conduct this is really to start conducting in sort of brisk 2/8. So I'm thinking yum, kind of like the is the hut of Baba Yaga, the Baba Yaga hut. So it's like. So we can actually play that. It's not actually, strictly speaking, a hemiola, because we're just shifting our focus from an obvious triple framework, but we're accenting willfully the duple environments. And so the only context will happen when the next voice comes in, which makes it even more of a surprise. So this one similarly starts out like it's going to be a nice kind of momentum, but And again, I really feel it would be impossible to conduct that properly because we wouldn't get a sense of the way the sound rang. You know, that, you know, I'm not thinking about three, four. I'm not thinking about the fourth beat. I'm thinking about the sound. I'm thinking about the gesture that I've just made. So we have to really react and interact with the material. I think this is important. There's also a funny kinship. We'll be talking about the C minor fugue from Book 2 shortly, and that's a. They're both wonderful examples of the following poetic function, which is anapest, which is two short, unstressed syllables followed by a long, stressed syllable. And so, isn't it nice that we actually have a poetic word that can describe an entire musical function? Basically, in the A minor, I'm talking about, right? And in the C minor fugue, I'm talking about, you know. So instead of saying, oh, 2/16 and an eighth, I could just say, oh, it's an anapest rhythm. It's so delightful. I just love that. Anyway, so we will be talking about the C minor shortly. There's a wonderful quote from David Ledbetter from his study of the Well Tempered Clavier, which I heartily recommend. He says, durational variation and the variegated local cellular gravity or distinction between repeated rhythmic patterns were the core principles of expression in the instruments of Bach's time. So I'm not describing postmodern reimaginings of variable notational parameters. This frangibility of rhythmic function was common parlance among professional musicians of Bach's own time. Acknowledging this dichotomy, the struggle for eminence between the moving, the motile, and the intractable, can be a regulating, resetting force essential not only to the statement of the subject, but accessible as a controlling influence in the main body of the fugue, sort of designed in occasions to rein in the tempo. That presupposes, a certain cooperation and accommodation by the other voices, but we'll get to that as well. So now I'd like to talk about ambiguous rhythm, or the quality of rhythm that makes it not one or another thing. So, for instance, duple and triple meter is an ambiguous aspect of rhythm that we use and avail ourselves of whenever I avail myself of it, whenever possible. We'll also talk about the negative space of rhythm, which are rests, and the negative space between the notes that we play. Because, first let's talk about rhythm in context. Defining or conveying where we are in the measure. Nature of each beat, for instance. We can talk about a 4/4 measure, we can talk about a group of 4/16 notes. The downbeat, and then if we were in a triple meter, 1, 2, 3, in a measure, we would have a saraband second beat, that kind of, that bow to the second beat that is so indicative of the saraband motion. Has a particular feeling and function. In a duple meter, the third beat would be the yang to the downbeat's yin, because for instance, this is a 4/4 measure, but it's largely broken into two parts. So 1. So I'm trying to establish a character so that the first beat does not sound like the third beat. And since they do the same things, it's important to make that distinction. And I think it can be made when we're conscious rhythmically of the role of the third beat in a 4/4 measure. In a triple meter, the third beat is anacrusis, upbeat, preparation for the renewed cycle at the downbeat. And the fourth beat of a duple meter would, of course, serve as anacrusis in that environment. We can and should apply an innate sense of this relationship to the bar line to the microscopic, magnified context of triplets and quadruple sixteenths. This is particularly important as we come to address weak links in the rhythmically concentrated continuum. This is again something I will provide practicable exercise in cultivating tensile integral mastery and flexibility in rhythmic environments, micro and macro. Ambiguous rhythm not only in terms of duple and triple. In a few cases, there is a contrasting or conflicting sense of rhythmic impetus or inertia between the fugue subject itself and the ensuing counter subjects. This often happens when a fugue subject's syllables are comprised of different rhythmic values. So we've got quarter notes. So this counter subject is how much faster? Twice as fast? 3 times? 4 times as fast as the opening material. So there's an inherent natural tendency to make one part of the material into a very stately and again a situation where we can reset the tempo if things are starting to be a little bit more flighty. These quarter notes will always stand up like a beautiful mountain in that regard. The fugue in D major from Book 1 again has 2 halves, 2 yin-yang natures. This first of all, it's belying its rather stately, majestic thing because we already start with a silent downbeat, so there's that, and then this drum roll really makes a lot of noise, and then we are suspended. And again, I think we need to make the sound dictate where the tempo goes. I don't think it works for me to just imagine some pre-existing tempo that we're grabbing onto. 1. I think there's variability to be done with how these sixteenths are to be snapped or to be used in a much more lyric way. So that's another rhythmic distinction that I think makes this one a very nice piece to talk about in terms of those juxtaposing elemental natures. The D minor from Book 2 has exactly that same kind of rustle of furioso triplet sixteenths, followed by this suspension and unheimlich, uncanny suspension of creeping chromaticism. So let me play a little bit of that. Oh, here's another. So I think of largely connected, detached. So that keeps it from being too same in the 2 rising function. Now here's my favorite part of this fugue is this counter subject. I forget all about. I mean, we know where that's going. So I don't think there's another piece in the 48 where I have such an envy of the counter subject that I decide to just pass off on the original theme. We're going to talk a little bit about hemiola, the overlay of a triple rhythm over a duple environment, or vice versa. This can occur on a micro level within a string of running sextuplets, or in a 6/8 environment, serendipitously making play with the ambiguous alternate inflection of triple over duple. we start off with a piece in 3/4 ostensibly, but I like to think of it in terms of being ambiguous and having 6/8 qualities. I also, you can tell from I've made these slurs that alternate between the right hand and the left hand at the half bar, that I'm not making an accent so much as I'm shifting the mirror to bring out. Um, well, I'm probably playing a little bit more legato in the slurred voices, not super legato, but probably a little bit more obviously detached in those that don't have slurs. But I'm really going for a little bit of ambiguity in that 6/8 kind of way. So rather than, I think having that the buoyancy of the 2 against 3 is a wonderful thing. And guess what? He follows through in the fugue and does literally the same thing. So here we're playing around with duple and triple. Here, this is obviously 3 because we don't want to have it. We don't want to belabor that repeated D. We can make one of them there. These considerations, when I try and talk about one of them, I realize how many of the others that we've talked about impact the discussion we're having and the music that we're discussing. So, obvious possibilities for hemiola. Sometimes we do it slightly more willfully than others. What I'm trying to do and it really is not really suggested in the music. But I think it would be nice to go against the grain. Yeah, I think that goes out with the proper amount of insouciance. A little bit more willful than I should be, but I like to make this into a little bit more hemiola-like. To make it part of the juggling act, because if we don't portray a little bit of that inherent ambiguity, I feel we're not getting the joke. I mean, that's why I sort of insist on making the last 2 measures of the whole Well Tempered Clavier a little bit of a joke. He's thumbing our nose at us a little bit. This is a perfect example of redressing the ambiguity of the rhythmic function of the piece. We're obviously in 3/4, and we can continue in 3/4. But I like to make it a 6/8 event at that point. That shakes things up quite nicely later on in the piece, to have that sudden infusion of a 6/8 energy into this very dogged 3/4 texture. The G sharp minor fugue is wonderfully ambiguous. So it can be, but how dull is that? If we just address it from the contour, we go up. So I go back and forth between the 2 and the 3, and they both coexist, and they both work against the other voices. And the more we can incorporate that ambiguity and not be one or the other, the more information we're actually putting across into this music. Even as we strive for ever greater familiarity and mastery of the ambiguities of rhythm on the page, we must turn our attention to the antimatter, to this pulsing matter, the silence between the notes. Of course, we must respect the rests, and that respect, or even attention, is at many times lacking, I confess. But we must also acknowledge and reassess our whole relationship with silence, not only in terms of respecting the rests, but in realizing the dark matter of anti-space that exists between each note, that ineffable yet essential space in preparation for a larger interval leap. That indefinable space we create by differentiating one note from another in a detached but still connected fashion. That flexible silence not dictated by the notations of rests themselves, but implicit in the lyric need for occasional breath. Here's my favorite example. There are no rests marked in this whole fugue subject, but I take occasion to make one space for a breath, and then another less capacious breath, and then one with almost no breath at all, so that I, with the silences between the syllables, I'm creating tension without making a crescendo, without making any kind of, I don't think I'm making any kind of tempo change, but see what you think. I hope that came across. One element, one syllable within a fugue subject may in fact have a more declarative, Beethoven-like fateful nature to be cultivated in contrast with another side of the theme, an element more searching, less authoritative, and therefore likely beginning in a more yielding, floating way. In fugue subjects of a more liturgical bent, with note values a stately and statuesque procession of half and whole notes, in these cases certainly at the inception, the solo statement of the theme, there seems to be no predetermined pulse or tempo. Our progress through time is dictated not by pulse, but by contour and content. That's my favorite example of a fugue subject that demands that we respect the sound of one note, the sound of one falling half step to another falling half step, and that it has nothing to do with tempo at all, and has everything to do with listening to the hall that we're in, listening to the piano that we're playing, and making that adjustment and saying there is no tempo here. There will be a tempo soon. There will be lots of influences making us want to move along, but right now, the sound should really dictate. Another example, the fugue, the beginning of the fugue, number 22 in B flat minor. I don't have the score for it up, but and of course, the greatest of all of them. That's what I mean when I say we follow the motives, we follow the syllables, and we want to be true in terms of making them sound well and making them sound in their own space. So I'm not thinking about a tempo. I'm not thinking about a metronome work. I'm thinking about how this sounds, how far it's ringing, how much care I need to make in terms of creating less and less space between the half steps on my way to creating not an outsized sense of climax, but one that builds naturally, not out of a sense of sound production, but in terms of less and less dark matter between each of these motives. These examples are both great for our finding instinctively the ideal pace within the simplest musical gesture. So now we're going to get into the flexibility of rhythm with a great emphasis and consciousness of intonation. The inherent lyric impulse and our vigilant awareness of steps and leaps directly affect our rhythmic momentum or momentousness. We use varied and relative space and distance between thematic notes based on their intervallic potential and projection. More fluid and compressed, with close motivic intervals, more spacious, expansive intervallic leaps suggesting a more expansive, reaching space between notes. As we always maintain heightened awareness of how the contour of each voice, its intonation, must be calibrated, we should also apply this same consideration to each voice with its own intonation requirements to be accommodated in rhythmic terms. This sounds a little complicated in that, as in great opera or in chamber music, one voice must make accommodation so their colleague can sing at their best. Each voice needs to have its occasional stretching of time according to its innate nature, and ideally there's a sympathetic and sensitive conductor pulling it all together. It helps us to always think of each voice as personified. It has a less dramatic metaphorical resonance when we apply these practical privileges to each voice and make accommodation accordingly. The simplest expression of rhythmic flexibility is in our ability to compress or expand the momentum of moving notes. When we compress a note stream, I refer to that as bunching. Although it would seem that the intentional bunching together of moving notes would bespeak a lack of rhythmic discipline, I have a favorite example of how Beethoven made manifest exactly that kind of bunching, specifically a notated direction in the pairs of slurred sixteenths in the Allegro vivace movement of his Sonata Opus 78. So you see these pairs. Actually, I'm starting at the previous page, aren't I? I think I am. Yeah. And you see them in two-note slurs, and we would normally go on our merry way, and in slow motion we would probably do something like. But when I fell in love with Arthur Schnabel's recordings of Beethoven, I think one of the things that when I went to the Montreal competition in 1981, was it? We were all gathered before we started competing, and the music critic of the Montreal Gazette, Claude Gingras, approached me and asked me how many recordings of the Beethoven sonatas I owned. This would supposedly bespeak a certain expertise. And I said, I have one, the Schnabel. Don't need any others. And this was one of the things that made me fall in love with Schnabel's playing, and gave me the sense that he had an inside track on what Beethoven was thinking. Was that he took those two-note slurs as an opportunity for bunching, but also they have a capacity for expansion. So when we get to the end, we perhaps do a little less bunching so that we can make a climax, again in slow motion. But I'm not exaggerating the snappishness of these, the way he did them. I should broaden a little bit at the end here. variously 4/16 in a row. But I kid you not. I'm pretty sure a couple of them he struck together. I'm pretty sure. And what that does is it gives it a certain nerve. Well, here is the place where it really just makes total sense, because instead of, I mean, I don't think that's what he was after, do you? But here at the end, you see what I did? Slowed down the 16th notes. So instead of snappy, they become lyric. So again, there's that rhythmic range of possibility. We have the ability to calibrate moment to moment, motive to motive, a progression from progressed rhythm to expanded rhythm in the service of creating rhythmic mass and tension. The inherent lyric impulse and awareness of steps and leaps affect our rhythmic momentum or momentousness. As we see in the Opus 78 example, one syllable can be variously altered, compressed, and subsequently expanded to create a dramatic arc, a developmental arc from the simplest of elements, 2/16 rubbing together to make fire. The C minor fugue, Book 1, presents us with a laboratory, a crucible of experimentation and exploration. I like to cultivate variation within its simplest syllable, the thrice repeated pair of anapest 16th notes, resulting in the final iteration, the final paired 16ths, finally landing emphatically and quite expanded on the downbeat strongly. It's an invitation to vary those motivic 16th upbeats so that they begin as snaps, perhaps flourishes, their magnetic pull making them very compressed and tentative at first, gradually putting a molecule space between the 16ths in each repetition, eventuating the final strong beat 16th as a more separate, more fatefully authoritative, emphatically uncompressed, fist-shaking 16ths in contrast to the more fluid, inciting, shaken 16ths of the opening. The final 4th 16th pair is not anapest, but arrives on the last downbeat of the subject's last measure. I begin tenuously, first in deference to the silence of the downbeat, then in more of a frisson than a declaration. The earliest 16ths are snapped, much as we first heard them in the Beethoven example, Opus 78. With the goal of a definitive arrival of the 16ths on the final downbeat, we can make our goal, our trajectory, to make those final 16ths broad and authoritative and evolve through the intervening pairs with greater and greater breadth. Eloquent, venerable character is the consequence of gradient compression growing into more elemental and defining and expansive emphasis. This subtle, subliminal, purposefully gradual retreatment of the 16th note motive engages wholly with our rhythmic parameter. This should be recognized as another tool in assaying the range of notational possibility, affecting palpably the trajectory of a subject or phrase. So you see how I started out sort of snappish, and then I'm a little bit more languid, a little bit more lyric, because that beautiful falling fifth, and then a little bit more operatic, the list of this, and already starting to broaden those 16th a little bit, and then really broaden them. It's a very good example of the manipulation, the alteration of one particular motive, one particular syllable in the theme, in the service of creating a much larger scale motion through the theme. We've examined rhythm at the subatomic, intonation-inspired note-to-note relation. Now let's address the colloquy between voices. It's often helpful to conceive of our two hands, or voices, in duet as sections of an orchestra. it's essential for us in the rhythm of reaction to make palpable the rhythmically reflected delay, the true reaction of one player or section of players to another, to make the relationship between our hands as between the violins and violas of an orchestra. While I realize we've all become adept at playing both hands together, I believe there should be an interactive, real-time sense of rhythm, the rhythm of reaction. Like conducting sections of an orchestra, we should feel and convey a sense of interaction and play between our hands when the texture calls for it. Like our compressed, expanded sixteenths, we can react to changes of harmony, register, dramatic tension, and relaxation simply within the play of true interreaction. In this example, I like us to think about this texture as not of one piece, but actually a reaction between the left hand and while I don't actually do a lot of monkey business of changing the space between the first and second 30 seconds, I do consider the space between the first and second sixteenths to be a frangible space. So you see how here in this passage I'm trying to make a single continuum about it, but at the same time I think it's important to make that consciousness of the alternating voices, these alternating hands, as he has it notated. Yes, this is also, as with everything now, one example that I've chosen for the interplay between two hands. I'm looking at it and immediately I'm thinking of it as an opportunity for hemiola. If we play them in time, that's no great feat. But if we can convey a sense of the distance, the reaction, the 0.03 seconds it takes for us to truly react to a stimulus, and if we can have that in mind and say, yes, we want to have a little bit of that dark matter inserted between the left and the right hands, I think it's a good cause. This idea of dark matter comes in very handy if we talk about rhythm now as rubato mediator and regulator. The F major prelude is my favorite illustrative example of how our currency, in this case constant eighth notes, can serve as mediator and regulator. The first time I conceived of this prelude as Bach's etude in rubato was coming to the sudden return of the F major recapitulation from a distant A major only a half bar before, prepared only with, or of course, a solo bass descending tetrachord. I felt the unending string of eighth notes not as a toccata-like perpetual motion exercise, particularly as I approached that unprepared return modulation by tetrachord with no apparent means other than those expanding ultimate eighths. If we think instead of the eighth notes as a continuum subject to influence from forces of necessity, like our unheralded return to F major, rather than as links in an unrelenting, unbending chain of eighth pulses, we engage that continuum on a note-to-note basis to accommodate our desire to make a more satisfying and compelling return from a long distance in a short time. And because we are always aware of the eighth notes as constant, it is all right for us as listeners. It's illuminating, actually. It illuminates the progression of time in the common currency of the moment, the eighth note. I had a similar feeling with the unalloyed forward motion of eighth notes approaching D minor towards midway through this prelude. I found I could similarly manipulate the eighths to accommodate my need to convey the gravity of a new dramatic harmonic arrival in the D minor inversion. But why save this superpower for special occasions? If we truly recognize this continuum of eighths to be frangible, variable at any desired moment, we take the leap into total grasp and facility in producing our own concept of time, compressed, expanded, or suspended, as we wish. If this seems like a radical departure, I call to your attention David Ledbetter's quote pertaining to the parlance among players of Bach's own time as being one thoroughly versed in exactly the type of flexibility and variation we are discussing. He says, durational variation and the variegated local cellular gravity or distinction between repeating rhythmic patterns were the core principles of expression in the instruments of Bach's time. If we want to gather courage in our new, freer and flexible attitude towards streams of moving notes as rhythmic fabric for us to experience and for us to gain control over, we can go one level deeper to gain confidence in our convictions and explorations. We can subdivide. As we approach that recapitulation in running eighth note tetrachords, we subdivide aloud in sixteenths. As we proceed in our ritardando rallentando towards recapitulation, we count sixteenths in an accordingly retardant rate. This type of subdivision asks as a skeletal substructure in our regulation of rubato. Even the most seemingly capricious rallentando can be justified on a deeper basis by counting, double time counting, encouraging our flexibility as natural and organic, authenticated. When we are counting double time, we are essentially creating bones within the prevailing fabric. In our F major prelude example, the fabric is eighth notes, so we count in sixteenths. We regulate on a molecular basis such that whatever we decide to do sounds organic because we have established an integral skeleton of inner rhythm. First arrival I wanted to deal with was this very sudden arrival at our tonic in F major. So approaching it from here, because I just, if we approach it this way, as my British friends would say, it's just not on. It's just not on. I really feel that we need to take this as Bach's cue or clue that we should use this fabric of eighth notes to make more comfortable these arrivals, to make an environment that accommodates change and surprise and resolve, true resolution. So if we're feeling a little less than confident in what we're doing in terms of time, as I say, we double time count. If we count, I know it sounds silly, but if we count double time, it sounds more organic. It feels more organic because we are actually regulating the bones underneath the passage as we decide to do our rubato. It's not just some, oh, I suddenly thought to slow down twice as much in the last two eighth notes. If we actually do it in a sort of a geometric progression, as one would do in a ritardando, and if we shore that up, if we authenticate that by counting double time and leading the rubato, leading the rallentando with that double time pace, it feels much more natural to me. In preparing for this lecture on rhythm, I'm reminded of the pianist and pedagogue Patricia Zander, with whom I studied for a summer. Patricia was a much beloved teacher in the Boston-Cambridge area. Prominent among her select collaborators was Yo-Yo Ma. He would undoubtedly credit her as more coach than accompanist. We worked together that summer on the Beethoven Opus 111 and the B minor Liszt Sonata. Patricia was the musician who initiated me into the mysteries of subatomic rhythm, space and time. She showed me how essential it is to engage with music as a fabric to be molded into the most compelling state we can muster. She showed me how much more information was discernible within and behind the notes on the page, and how it was our responsibility as interpretive artists to infuse our performance with as much of this arcane information as can be conveyed in an unburdening way. Not in some arcane way, but with a palpable connection and interaction with the materials at hand, as flexible, frangible, thirsting for imaginative interaction and interpretation. Patricia insisted we acknowledge and be always aware of the silence between the notes, the dark matter which can expand and cause friction or inertia, tenuto or toe-shoed flight. Remembering Leon's second law, which posits our responsibility for how we pick up the note, we are in a constant state of deciding how to approach silence, how to end the note, abruptly or gently. And how do we leave silence? Leaving silence is the ineffable name of something, Patricia mentioned this a lot, something quite intimidating that we effortlessly achieve every time we begin a piece we know and love. I've only in the last year or so made prominent in my perspective and practice, but Patricia showed me the ineffable but essential concept of potential subatomic space between these blistering sixteenths, space which can be expanded as if their little note heads were beginning to fill with air, shouldering each other such that each demands more breadth, more to create a more imposing sense of mass and impending climax. I've come to manifest this visually in my head as larger or smaller note heads, sixteenths progressing properly, but then each note head expands, demanding more inertial force, physical space around it, each sixteenth sticking its elbows out more and more aggressively until the passage of time is expanded accordingly. Patricia was always inciting us to expand. Opus 111, and lots of Beethoven, has many passages of hell-raising sixteenths in its opening movement, marked at a very loud volume. How do we create a sense of peak, of climax, at the end of such an unremitting assault? If you're already playing as loud as you can, where can you grow? How do you make the peak massive and inevitable? We need to acknowledge and engage with the dark matter between each note, ephemeral or black hole dense according to our local awareness. Patricia was the first and only one who made this arcana of the unseen, these quirks of musical sub-nuclear reality, into practicable interpretive tools. Another of my teachers, Russell Sherman, noted that Beethoven requires 120% of our sound, wrought by only his infallible inner ear, Beethoven's, and technique. Beethoven always asks us to strain the limits of possibility. What Russell posited as the unreachable goal, Patricia illuminates pragmatically the matter of rhythm and the antimatter, the dark matter of negative space. I initially thought this would be an instructive lesson of how to deal with a seemingly unending onslaught of Furioso sixteenths. In preparing it, though, I realized how many tools we've already discovered which mitigate against the onslaught in a number of ways, contour dynamics being the most prominent escape valve to the relentless forte cascades. We still hit our heads on the ceiling long before we resolve into the second theme, as the tandem sixteenths rise into the decidedly fortissimo averse highest register of the piano. This is specifically where we enlist the expansion of dark matter between the notes to attain climactic resolution. It's so funny, isn't it, how Beethoven, particularly in this piece, makes tempo markings kind of within the staff sometimes, so as if he's suggesting them more than he's being directive about them. When we cannot expand further dynamically, we can gradually, infinitesimally add dark matter between the notes as we build. The limit of such expansion and freedom is only the degree to which we can maintain the suspension of disbelief that these are still believable as 16th notes. We resort to the manipulation of the rhythmic fabric, the fabric of time, when we have reached the immediately apparent boundaries of possibility within the physical limits of sound. As I was working through this passage, I wanted it to be an example of expanding rhythmically, but there were so many other things that I started thinking, well, our falling tetrachord, to actually think about that rather than to knock them all out. And then using these eighth note staccatos to stick our elbows out a little bit more, to make that facilitative, to make that climactic, responding to the A flat arrival. He's got those carrot stick staccatos on them, but I'm deciding to do those as Berlin staccatos, so that we get the incisiveness, but we acknowledge the lyric quality of the A flat major. And then yes, the only pedal mark that we have is on that fortissimo, introducing the second theme. So, gosh, it's so fun to play the pedal. I haven't used one in a couple of years. Patricia taught me that our relationship with silence includes not only acknowledging the dark, malleable matter between notes, but the ineffable feeling preceding the very first notes of a piece. My favorite is the always audible intake of breath, usually edited out of most commercial recordings, but discernible before the downbeat of any ensemble recording Nicholas Harnoncourt ever made. You know, if he's doing the Beethoven symphonies, you hear before they start. I think it's wonderful. Another option is cursing the darkness, with a definitive crash. Works for something like the Tchaikovsky First Concerto, and even the A major fugue, our friend. But leaving the silence, as Patricia counseled, can be mysterious, a nearly inaudible incursion on the darkness. Leaving the silence can be a surprise, like some Brahms pieces I know that give us the sense of having suddenly opened the door to a grand ball already in celebratory progress. When we actively engage with the rhythmic fabric of music, we cease to be masters of mere amplitude or even the niceties of articulation. Now we truly engage with space and time. I want to lend you some practical applications to shoring up the inner rhythm of passages, making bones of these passages that demand them. The first example is our C minor prelude from Book 1. We create an internal tension that externalizes, projects as super even. This really strengthens the evenness if you're into that sort of thing. I've played this anything but evenly, but what I'm suggesting is we've all heard about the way we can practice, and then the opposite of that dotted rhythm, and each of those shores up one particular part of the 4-note pattern. We can accentuate the offbeats, and then we can accentuate the real offbeats rather than the second and fourth. We can accentuate the first and third. I think it's more challenging and more worthwhile to count aloud the dotted rhythm, but try and play as evenly as possible. So. And then what that does is it forces you to practice slowly, so it's important for that reason, and it's important for me in my particular way with this piece, because rather than play sort of mirror images of one another, the upper voice with the lower voice, I tend to, you see in my score, I tend to switch those slurs. I don't do them super legato, but it's a way of showing notationally that I'm shifting the mirror. So in other words, I'm going to concentrate on the upper voice to begin with, and then switch to the lower voice. What I'm in fact doing is I'm playing the left hand short when it's not slurred, and when it's slurred, I'm playing it long and the other note short. And I alter that throughout the piece. And so if we if we are assured of practicing at a slowest tempo, and we can actually incorporate that kind of articulative rabbit hole, it's a very good technique for shoring up those weak notes. You know, that we often think in terms of four note groups or four measure groups. So usually in a phrase of four measures, the fourth measure is usually getting short shrift because we're already thinking about the next phrase. And likewise, on a micro level, if we're dealing with 4/16ths, the fourth 16th, we're already thinking very seriously about moving on. So it's important to find ways to shore up the weakness, or the perceived weakness, or the apparent, or hopefully not too serious weakness of the weak notes of a pattern, the weak fingers of the hand, as we also tend to like to concentrate. A friend of mine, the jazz drummer Dave King, with the Bad Plus, recommended that we practice with the metronome, but have the metronome fall on the 4th 16th. I think that would be something to try. Yes. Subdividing is part of this shoring up process of making evenness, but it's also the subdividing is a very good way of being a substructure in regulating rubato. When we are counting double time, we are essentially creating the bones within the prevailing fabric. In the prelude, in F major, the fabric is the 8th note, so we count in 16ths. So doing this as a practice, basis really helps. Another perhaps rhythmic sense of impetus and relaxation. I thought it was worth noting that I've come to feel that we should, when we're looking at this left hand part, if we look at it as an 8-note pattern, and this happens with some other pieces I'll get to. I'm tending to, just for matters of definition and clarity, you see I've marked a dot on the last two of those. Part of that is to try and leaven the sameness of, right? I just hate that idea of toggling. I like making a decision about the direction of this. So for instance, I feel we go to the A already. I actually diminuendo to the top, so that I can grow a little bit for the last bit. I'm definitely, you can see I've made several slash marks over the weeks between here and here, so that I don't run the risk of going after that. The other nice thing about shortening those last two notes of the pattern is that I give lyric room to the upper voice, so that if I play those last two notes short, there's no helping the upper voice, but to be able to sing out. also, again, we get into regulating and abetting the rubato of the upper voice by regulating the rhythm, the pace of the left hand accompaniment. So you hear me at this very particular place where the right hand is doing a lot of filigree and coming down a long way. I make a nice little spread with those 16ths, not just shortening the last two, but actually slowing them down. Literally, when I decided to make this my new rule, I've decided to work this into my work on the A minor. In our running patterns of 6/16ths, I always dot the last two of any group, not necessarily super staccato, but with a discernible sense of definition of themselves as the anapest to the next big beat. It also produces a nice varied sound to leaven the unremitting 16ths, and more importantly, we are taking the responsibility for the inner rhythm of each 6/16ths group as if a 3/8 measure of its own. This also works well in allowing the rejuvenation of our E minor prelude accompaniment as a way to clear and prepare the sound, prepare the ground for the upper voice's freedom in resolution. Clearing the air, making a more decided shortness in the last two notes of this accompaniment pattern engenders a much more cantabile sound in the upper voice just by virtue of being the only slightly sustained voice still sounding. New, but I mean, so rather than just, I hate that. So not terribly short, but definitely distinct. Always the last two. I think shoring up rhythmically the weak 16th, the fourth, for instance, of each beat, or the weak eighth, the last of our implied 3/8, let's say, is a function of internal rhythm, but honorably internalizing it projects to the listening audience.